20 minutes. 20 minutes, Michael. Keep them down to fucking 20 minutes.
We're going to try our best. But this is part 2 of this Russia shit.
Yeah, I can't keep anything down to the minutes that they talk about. We do these events constantly.
Hey,
and people are like, okay, we're going to have a 15-minute conversation about this. It's like, oh, you haven't talked to me yet. We're not going to have a 15-minute conversation.
So, Comey. We're on the topic of Comey. And I'm going to switch us slightly and drag us back into the realm of policing. Because not long after Commissioner Kevin Davis was officially sworn in, I was, still working in, I guess you might say, mainstream media. Though it was, I guess, alternative media here. But I got to interview him, and one of the things he said was that he would like to see police leadership better insulated from politics. And obviously that's in the aftermath of Anthony Batts being removed and then him stepping into the interim commissioner role before eventually being sworn into the actual commissioner's role. And he cited as an example of a way to insulate a police commissioner, a head of a police department from politics, the fact that the FBI director has a 10-year term established by Congress with specifically the intent of insulating the FBI director's decisions from political pressure from the executive department of which the FBI is a part. But clearly we have seen, based on the actions of this last week and a half, that insulation is not perfect. And so I'm curious, specifically because your model is another sort of hypothesis for how to effectively remove police issues and the oversight of policing from the political sphere. What do you think of the policy of having sort of designated terms like 10 years as a mechanism for achieving a similar aim?
Well, whenever we talk about these other police commissioners, and even especially Kevin Davis, I'm going to have to point out that he still just has no idea what he's even talking about on that subject. The Comey, for instance, has a 10-year contract, but it's just like a contract. It's not the end all be all. It's not a term like a judge. It's a contract. Well, Kevin Davis signed a 6-year contract as well because the Baltimore police commissioner has a contract that has a term that's supposed to serve the exact same purpose, but yet the commissioners in Baltimore get fired every 3 to 6 months, or something. Yeah, luckily they've been a little bit longer lately.
Yeah,
but I mean that's not true in Baltimore on his level. If he was interested in that, he would be interested in what I hypothesize as the mitigating factor of not taking politics out of policing, but taking the politicians out of policing and putting it into the politics of the people. What he's really arguing for, and they really argue for in that dynamic, is for them to have more power, and that is not changing the dynamic of power. That's changing who's in power. That's why they're full of shit.
So that kind of concludes the Comey discussion, really. But we can't have a 3.5-minute podcast. So, but I think this raises a separate issue, still related to your work, and this relates to this concept that I think you're part of developing. This idea of a police science, a police scientist, and we had this a sort of version of this, a short version of this conversation once upon a time, back the first time I think I interviewed you. But there's this question of whether what might currently exist as the closest thing to what you mean by police scientist or science, which is something like the criminal justice studies field, criminology, whatever that is. It does seem like oftentimes it's hammers finding nails and always seeing nails. It's not clear like what actual scientific method is involved in sort of like coming to the conclusions that is reached in a lot of sort of criminology or criminal justice fields, from my perspective, or organizations like PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum. Do you think there are today voices in the field of policing that are legitimate conversation partners in a conversation about reform? Are there any that you see? Or do you feel like they're all like Commissioner Davis persons who, in your opinion, should not be left in charge of these decisions?
So that I want to separate the criminology then from let's go practitioners from scholars. I don't think there are practitioners in existence right now. And I think the system would prevent that from occurring. You can't get to that elite club if you were not in full buyout in the dynamic of what criminal justice is based off of.
Okay.
In the scholarly field, I think you have a lot now that are growing. So Tracy Mears from Yale is one that I can point to as the one I've always thought was closest to what I was talking about, and what she was missing was just a practitioner element. Mm-hmm. So she had like the how it goes and why you should be this way, but not necessarily how that policy translates into action on the ground, because she's a criminologist, not a business management thing. So that's kind of where I see that better from being a practitioner and the business side. So I think scholarly wise, you see a lot of that, but that's not, they're in criminology, but the criminology is based off of all these premises that they have to shed, because those premises we know are bad data. So we have to. I feel like we should.
Data at all? Are they empirical
You're right.
premises?
No, they're not. I mean, it's junk science. So just call it that, which we shouldn't be calling science at all. We just call it junk. So it's junk, and those people really should probably be moved over into something that's a different field, which is police science, which is not that data, which is us starting anew, saying what is policing in this context and how do we have a perpetually self-improving system.
And so how do you produce then the practitioners that it seems like you'd feel are needed as part of this conversation?
I think you needed that to develop the system. Once the system is there, that should be integrated within. And so I would separate that by, I think all chiefs should be local cops that come up through the ranks and they stay solely in that police world. We try to make CEOs out of cops. And that's a really silly idea at any level. Can you imagine if you ran Ford and you were choosing the CEO of Ford as the mechanic of the year? And that's kind of what we do in policing. So these people just don't have the skill set to do this.
I'm curious what you thought about the relationship of like good managerial skill sets to I don't know, maybe the skills that predominate among police officers. You know, did you find that effective management in that way was a fairly rare talent, or was it just hit or miss, or what was it?
No, I think the culture actually messes up effective management.
Oh, wow.
Because we have this idea. Okay, so one thing that happens all the time is somebody is a shitty cop and they get promoted and everybody hates them and thinks they shouldn't be promoted. But whether that person is a crappy cop or not has nothing to do with their ability to manage a squad of police officers. So just because you're a bad cop doesn't mean you're a bad manager, and just because you're a good manager doesn't mean you'd be a good cop. So like we have to get those ideas out of policing's head. So that's why I kind of want to separate that. I think that's a weak link, that we need to kind of pull out that management somehow, in that policing as management becomes supervision, and management is done by trained managers.
So, but then let me ask, like, how do you avoid the problem long term of getting back to a situation then where the management is making decisions without the benefit of the practitioner experience?
Right. I mean, you could feasibly get to that point in some aspect, but I'm not going to believe that the practitioners have the data that's relevant so much. They're collectors of the data, and as long as we make sure that they're accurately collecting the data and getting it to the scholars, and then that policy is developed, I don't think their influence is as valuable as they think it is. Does that make sense? Like they do that all the time. They're like, they do this to me, and it really frustrates me. It frustrates me immensely on TYT when this happens, because Cenk will say something to me and go, well, let's turn to this guy and ask him. He was a Baltimore cop. I say, do not believe me because I was a cop. That has nothing to do with my ability to articulate this issue. If anything, you should not be appealing to my authority as a police officer in this instance at all. If you want to listen to cops, then you would then say that we should go listen to Comey as a what it is, or we should listen to Sessions because now that's the highest law enforcement officer in the land, right? Like, that's not your authority.
No, I think that's fair. I guess my concern kind of comes from like the scholarship side, and knowing how imperfect as sciences are all of the social sciences, because as you've observed, they are applying quantitative methods to a qualitative environment in many instances. And so, I'm someone who sort of spent a lifetime immersed in the scholarship side, even though it wasn't principally in the social sciences. My research touched on that. And when I started to engage the realities that sort of research talked about abstractly, I felt like everything I knew was so inadequate to the situation. And so I guess there's based on that, perhaps irrationally, a skeptical part of me that wonders how much faith can we place in in sort of a scholarly class that eventually could become disconnected from the practice, and therefore not necessarily realize how connected or disconnected the research is to the on-the-ground condition.
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt, I think what we're talking about it's one of these examples where the pursuit of perfection is the enemy of achievement.
That's
and
fair.
I want everyone to understand this way. Think of it this way. We get caught up in the outcomes. So we do something where, say, we can only bat 75%. It's the only thing we can do is hit 75%. So we do something. We go and try a system that is 35% effective, and the outcome is positive. So we go, all right, this is the methodology we're going to stick with, and we try the 70% one, and it fails for that one. We go, oh, throw that one away. And it's like, well, no, we have to choose the best methodology, even if we occasionally get bad outcomes, because it is the best methodology that is the pursuit, not the best outcome. And that is what is constantly screwing us up, is this pursuit for outcomes. So as long as we keep sticking in this methodology, we can have a mitigating factor on that separation, as far as I can see, because we'll stick in the best methodology.
And so let me follow up with this question. Namely, I was wondering if you could just unpack a little bit for what you mean by police science when you use that term, for persons who maybe have heard us say it on the show but didn't necessarily know what it meant.
All right. So science, as we would know, is just finding something, creating a hypothesis, testing it, and then trying to verify what your hypothesis was again by retesting it. And each time you retest it, you get a little bit more confident in it, but you always leave out the possibility of doubt. That's what I'm talking about. But actually doing it in policing, which people would say, well, don't police do that now? No. And that is a hard thing for us to swallow. So I use lead poisoning as my number one thing to try and explain what this would mean. So if policing was looking at crime from a scientific perspective, and they said which variable is most correlated to violent crime that we can fight to lower violent crime, the number one thing by miles and miles and miles is lead poisoning. But there's not a single police agency in this country fighting it, because they're not approached on science. They're actually in criminology and criminal justice, which is an ideology and a religion. I want this to become a science.
Let me ask this. With respect to that religion that you obviously were familiar with for some time, you're like you're like an apostate from policing. Interesting. What describe to someone, as a former believer, maybe, describe to someone who is concerned about policing but has never had that sort of direct and access. Like, what are the motivating principles of this religion?
So the motivating principles are this idea that punishment equals reduction or of violence crime or punishment is a means of controlling human behavior. And so when that started, maybe it was plausible at the time. So this is like the real thing with criminal justice and how it starts, is that it started tracking it in America, we know, with slave catching. That's the history of it. So that's when its data starts. So its problem is that it starts in a bad data point where they didn't look at what was happening before then, have then tried to say, well, we're going to take all this and approach it from a scientific perspective. And they did use scientific methodologies to approach this perspective from all these years, but they've done it under two false premises. And that was that they had good data that they were starting with, and that punishment is a deterrent. So we have moved on in social sciences and have pretty much determined that punishment is not a deterrent for human behavior. But that did not then cross fields from the social sciences over into the criminology sciences and try to change that paradigm and realize it was based off of a false premise. So they haven't changed that. So they still are in this world where you don't write the laws, you just enforce them. We go out there and we throw people in jail because that's what will be better for them. That will get them, they'll learn a lesson and they'll come out and they'll be better. The idea that recidivism rates and the marginalization that is created by prison actually makes their conditions worse is something that does not come back into criminology because they have no feedback loop at all. Like, even policing itself does not have any metrics to say, if we were to get a job, we were going to approve crime. They do not take anything they do and say, okay, crime is at this level, we're going to isolate the variables and we're going to change this about what we do, and then this result, we're going to at least be able to correlate to this. This takes place nowhere in any police department in this entire country. So we don't continue to not have any good data.
This is kind of disheartening.
But it shouldn't be, because we can get the right data. We know it's wrong. That's the first thing, is know it's wrong.
No, but here's why it's kind of disheartening. So clearly this faith is not based on any information. And
it's a social construct almost.
No, it's a complete. I mean, you're right. I think describing it as a religious tenet is a fair way to do it, because all religious tenets are social constructs. But for those interested, there's a book by the pragmatist philosopher Richard Rorty titled "Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity." In a portion of that book, he talks about the novel 1984. And if I'm mistaken on a few things, I'm doing this off memory, but one of the things he's talking about is the fact that one of the points the book is essentially making is that is about torture, and how torture is for the sake of torture. It doesn't serve any other purpose, and deep down, even the torturer knows that. And when you describe policing disconnected from any real end outside of policing itself, it starts to feel like police are at the same moral level as the torturer. They don't care that they're imposing harm. The point of what they do is an end in itself.
Right, but you got to remember that it is that, because they don't have a goal towards abolishment. They don't have a goal to end their purpose, which would be fighting crime. So if they actually fought crime, they would defeat their entire purpose. That's why you can't fight crime. You have to fight the causations of crime, because they will always exist.
No, I'm not disagreeing with that. It just it paints a very dark moral picture of policing, right? Because it suggests that they're not fighting crime, right? Because at that point, if policing is an end in itself, the end is not fighting crime. The point is just to do this shit. I go out here and I bust heads because that's what I do. It doesn't fucking matter whether it's attached to another end. And that is a dark vision of the persons we rely on to protect us. I mean, that's staggering.
But that's our future. Like, that's the Orwellian model, and that's what people want. Yeah, you're right. That's our present. We said that. That's what people are still wanting for, and why I get frustrated, because it's the left saying we need to do more punishment. punish those people who are offending us. So it's not a fight for equality, and it's not a fight to change the dynamic of power. It's to change who is in power. So the fucking left is constantly fighting to be the oppressor, not to end oppression, and that is driving me crazy. And it's kind of starting to make a little bit of enemies with me, with a more prominent people with me, because I'm saying, when you are asking and thinking that justice is putting somebody into a system that you know is oppressive and harmful and inhumane, then you are only fighting to be the oppressor.
I agree. I 100% agree. Been arguing that for a little while.
Bitches, it's driving me nuts, and I don't know what to do with it. But I like, going forward, if we can rationalize and look at these systems and see that this is reality, this is what it is, but we can fix it. We know how to do this. I mean, it's like, we can all look at Exxon and say, look, Exxon is a money-making, global domination machine, right? I want to take that entire structure and I want to give it to you. Like, that's what I'm talking about with policing. It's taking that model and not the pursuit of money, the pursuit of actual justice and the ending of oppression. Like, that can be your weapon.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many, I don't want to go too much longer, but there's just so many incentives for removing policing from the realm of the state and returning it to the realm of society. Right, like, just that alone, I think, to me, is a fight worth having, and a debate worth having, especially. You know, let's have that conversation. Like, do we really think policing is best as an instrument of the state?
I mean, that's all they can be then, is an enforcement wing, right? I mean, that's what they ended up as, the enforcement wing of the politicians. But that's the only result, if that's...
Yeah.
Like, I mean, that is what they are. I mean, you're kind of codifying it as a local army for a politician. And if we're going to have local armies, they need to be for the people.
Yeah. You know, and I suppose, you know, our own attitude that says police don't write the laws, they just enforce them. Which, I mean, I'm sure the police feel that themselves, but I think most of us would agree. We don't want the police writing their own laws. But at that point, what we've said is policing will always just be its own end, because they're not actually involved in thinking about the problem. They just do. And you're right. That means only enforcement. It can't be anything else.
Police don't make the laws. We just mitigate their enforcement. That's the way it should be. Like, we take their intent and put it into practical reality.
Yeah. So we turned them into the 1984 torturer.
Yeah. I mean, I feel that way. We keep saying that. Like, there was this tweet the other day. I had to put it out just because I get so frustrated with constantly being ignored on this subject, that in 2014, when they were talking about putting body cameras on Baltimore police officers, I tweeted out, 2K cameras on every single cop out in the country sounds awfully Orwellian to me. And now, here we are 3 years later, we're finally starting to go, oh no, this can be a scary concept. I know, like, think about these things.
No, definitely. I mean, that the ACLU Maryland has always had that concern about the program here. And, you know, they've been involved to try to, like, tailor a policy that buffers against that possibility. I don't think they know. I mean, it can't protect. They're collecting all this data and storing it somewhere. You know, they try to mitigate it by imposing how long it can be stored, that sort of thing. But yeah, there's no question. And you know, this software gets more sophisticated, and
facial recognition.
I know,
so
it's
now,
already very sophisticated.
Like, think about the cars. So we have the car tag readers now, which are kind of neat. It can go through it. It reads all the tags, and you can find out if a car is stolen or not. But now everybody that goes to a protest or goes to speak for their First Amendment rights that has a warrant out from 1962 on a missed traffic violation, they're going to yoke you up when the minute you pass a cop. So you think about that fear, like that of the blue lights when they're pulling you over, how that reaches an innate fear in most people. Now, when you go out and every cop that's walking around is running you through a computer database the moment you walk past them, dude, you're going to be walking around like just looking for uniforms, trying to avoid them. How is that not an Orwellian future?
I know. And you know, the thing, and let me just, this is the last thing I'll say. Sometimes people say, oh, you know, that's a slippery slope. It's not going to go that far. But in a system where we see that we're essentially trapped in a cycle where our own demands as a society that, one, our laws be enforced but not written by the police. So, we create a condition in which policing becomes its own end. When they have these tools in a context where policing is its own end, it will be used for whatever purpose it can be used for. And so it's not a question of, are we being sort of hyperbolic and going down a slippery slope that isn't actually there, in saying they have this technology could be used as a major surveillance tool. In a system where policing becomes its own end, I think you have to be very cautious about what tools you empower police with. And we saw that very vividly in Ferguson, not with surveillance equipment, but with military grade equipment at a First Amendment event. And so, I think, which is why this conversation about whether police should be an arm of the state or arm of the people is society of the community. That's really the question I think we need to be having.
I can't think of a better note to end it. I'm really an arm of the state. They are.